Welcome to Solomon's webinar on the world's best base oil refineries. My name is Mike Achicoso. I'm the manager of lubricants and specialties here at Solomon. And first of all, I want to wish that you and your families are staying safe in today's trying times. So thanks for tuning in. What does it take to be a world's best base oil refinery? During this webinar, I will be talking about 8 characteristics. I'll be talking about how reliable these operators are, what kind of technology they use. Are they hydroprocessing or solvent-based? How old are these refineries? Are they or are they not integrated with a fuels refinery? Then we're going to talk about how efficiently they operate their facilities. What are their staffing levels? Do they do capital investment? And if so, how much to improve energy efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? We will discuss their yield profiles and wrap up with how they maintain their facilities. So I hope you will find these 8 characteristics very interesting and hopefully be able to apply them to your own base oil refinery. These are very trying times for us. We've had a double shock in both supply and demand. And these are extraordinary times, and we're faced with big challenges. Now more than ever, the decisions that you make will set the stage for how your companies will perform after all this is over. Solomon, we look to be your trusted advisor. We have a very good database. We can apply real-world industry knowledge and provide data-driven decisions to help you improve your business. So let's talk about the selection criteria. What do I mean when I say a world's best? Solomon has a very extensive database that goes back close to 40 years. Our lube study database contains 54% of the worldwide paraffinic base oil refining capacity. We looked at 3 studies. Our studies happen every 2 years, the last one being in 2018. So the data for this is based on 3 studies or 6 years of actual operating performance data. There were 4 metrics that we use to select the world's best refineries. The first one is operational availability. I'll discuss more of what that means, but that is our version of measuring reliability. It's measured on a worldwide basis, and I've split that out, you'll see, between hydroprocessing and solvent-based technology. The second thing that we look at is return on investment. This is a measure of how much cash these companies are returning back to their shareholders. We look at that based on refining supply corridor group to make sure that we are matching market conditions. The third thing that we look at is energy intensity or energy efficiency. We measure that on a worldwide basis. And we also look at maintenance cost efficiency. How well are they using their maintenance funds to maintain operational availability and overall good operations? So these are the 4 metrics that we used. And to qualify as world's best, you have to be in the top half of all 4 metrics for at least 2 of the 3 study years. It's all well and good to have a good performance year, but the key to being world's best is being able to sustain that over time. There are 6 base oil refineries that comprise the world's best peer group, and they're equally split in regions of the world. We have 2 in North America, we have 2 in Europe, and we have 2 in Asia. So hopefully you understand the criteria for being a world's best base oil refinery. But what key insights can we derive from looking at their performance over time? The first thing I'll start off with is operational availability or reliability. We see that the world's best have 97% or better operational availability. This maximizes the uptime. In a base oil refinery, if you look at the whole supply value chain, the base oil refinery is a key link in that. If you have marketers who are customer facing, they need to know that they have product on a ratable and dependable supply basis. But how does Solomon define operational availability? First, you start out with 100% available. This means that your base oil refinery is operating at full capacity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. But we all know that our refineries need to come down periodically for both planned and unplanned maintenance. The planned maintenance usually occurs during a turnaround, and a turnaround is at a certain interval. The number of days down, we annualize that. And we also look at downtimes that occur outside of the turnaround period. So these start to subtract from that 100% operational availability. There's also other things that happen, and we call that process and regulatory. Examples of these can be catalyst changeout. It could be heat exchanger cleanings, anything of that sort that would cause a downtime. So if you start with 100% availability and subtract these things, you have a resulting operational availability. I mentioned that the world's best are able to maintain 97% or better availability. Let's look at that on a worldwide distribution basis. If you've never seen a Solomon chart before, let me take a minute to orient you to how we look at this data. On the bottom or x-axis, you'll see quartiles and color codes. We split the distribution of our study participants according to quartiles, 25%. So the first quartile, or the green section, is the top 25% of the distribution. If I go all the way to the right, the red or the fourth quartile is the bottom 25% of that distribution. We distribute this based on EDC, our equivalent distillation capacity factor, and that allows us to normalize all our refineries based on their size and complexity. So you'll see on the y-axis operational availability, and we've drawn a line on that 97% target. The worldwide distribution, you can see that most of the first quartile actually is at 97% or better. And WB, or the world's best, is the weighted average of those 6 world best refineries. And you'll see that they are higher than 97%, and higher is better. So that's the first thing that you will find out with the world's best, is that they have 97% or better operational availability. The second thing that we looked at was the technology. And technology is solvent-based or hydroprocessing-based. So solvent-based technology is solvent extraction, solvent dewaxing. Hydroprocessing is lube hydrocracking, iso dewaxing. A lot of people think that because hydroprocessing facilities tend to be newer, they're probably more available than the solvent technology. But looking at the world's best, of those 6 refineries, 3 of them are hydroprocessing based, and the other 3 are solvent based. So there's a mix of both. But let's look at those 2 different technologies on an operational availability basis. So this is the same graph that I showed, but now there are 2 distribution curves. I've split the distribution into hydroprocessing, which is the red curve, and solvent, which is the gray curve. You will notice that the solvent-based facilities actually have a competitive advantage over the hydroprocessing-based. In terms of overall, the distribution has a higher operational availability. That's because hydroprocessing facilities have catalyst, and they do have to come down every 2, 3, 4, 5 years to change out catalyst. That is an automatic built-in operational availability hit. I've also split those 6 world best refineries into hydroprocessing and solvent, and you can see they're both above 97%. They're both in the first quartile. All right. So this is a A misconception could be that solvent-based technology are at a disadvantage to hydroprocessing, and that's not the case when it comes to operational availability. Let's talk about age of the world's best. The average age for this peer group is 32 years. Some people may find that surprising because they feel that to be world's best, I have to have new equipment because new equipment is reliable and it will translate to higher operational availability. But that's not necessarily the case. Let's look at operational availability, but now I've split the distribution, or I've characterized that distribution on the x-axis in unit age in years. Operational availability is still on the y-axis, and remember the world's best are a little over 97%. If you look at this distribution, there's really no trend. There's a scatter of data everywhere. And no matter how young your facility is or how old your facility is, there are good performers and there are bad performers. And what we've seen over time is that the good performers, as their facilities age, spend, well, I won't say spend, but they utilize best practices to operate and maintain their facilities in the most efficient way possible. You can spend a lot of money to maintain your facilities, but if it's not targeting the right things to improve the operational availability, it's not a very efficient use of funds. Integration of the world's best base oil refinery with fuels. We found that most of the world's best refineries are integrated with a fuels refinery. And there's obvious competitive advantages for that. One, there is feedstock supply. There is a return for streams from the base oil refinery back to fuels. There's also shared services such as personnel and utilities. That's usually the case, but there are world's best refineries that are not integrated with a fuels refinery. And that can be good because usually if you're a base oil refinery integrated with a fuels refinery, many of the economic decisions are based on fuels economics versus lube economics. And fuels economics, just due to the sheer volume, can overwhelm the lube economics. But let's not forget that lube economics, it's a smaller volume, but it's a higher margin for that volume. So while it's not necessarily a disadvantage to not be tied to a fuels refinery, most of the world's best are. So before I go on to the next four sets, this is setting the stage now. Hopefully to this point, you're seeing a common theme that's starting to thread across the world's best. The world's best have good operational availability as its foundation. We do know that good operational availability maximizes uptime, maximizes production of products, and allows you to efficiently operate your facility. But operational availability also is the foundation for other important things in operating a base oil refinery. It sets the foundation for good personnel safety, good process safety, and environmentally responsible operations. A refinery that's not having reliability issues, are not exposing their personnel to hazardous conditions, not experiencing loss of containment, or releasing things to the atmosphere. Good operational availability also allows your organization time to implement best practices, time to improve your operations, and overall improve the efficiency. So far, the world's best webinar that I've been discussing with you, this is just a subset of our research on the world's best base oil refineries. If you're a client of Solomon, we do have a paper. We can benchmark your specific facility versus the world's best and do a gap analysis. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive deeper into how these world's best base oil refineries operate. How do they achieve good operational availability? And let's start with personnel or staffing. We found out that the world's best have 5% higher staffing levels for non-maintenance personnel versus the world average. Let me show you the distribution curve for that. So again, you have the quartiles on the bottom x-axis, but now you'll see a non-maintenance personnel efficiency index on the y-axis. We look at number of work hours, and we compare that versus a standard, a Solomon standard of how many work hours your facility should be experiencing based on your size and complexity. We looked at this index, and if your index is higher, that means you have higher work hours than what we would deem deem standard. And as you go lower, that means that you're at or below our standard number of work hours. When I talk about non-maintenance, these are people like operators. These are people like administrative services. These are technical people like engineers. When I plot the world's best on here, you'll see the world's best are actually in the upper third quartile. Many people find this surprising. Many people think that I have to be first quartile in everything to be world's best. And that's a misconception, and that can be very dangerous if you look at one metric in isolation. Solomon recommends that you look at all your metrics holistically to make sure you arrive at the right decision. In this case, for the world's best, they choose to staff higher in areas that support operational availability, such as reliability engineers, such as inspection, things of that sort. So while you may think that third quartile performance in non-maintenance personnel is bad, holistically, if that's driving high operational availability, that's a good thing. Let's look at energy efficiency and emissions. We looked at the investment patterns of the world's best over time, and we found out that there was pre-investment going on for energy efficiency. Here's a Solomon distribution curve for energy efficiency. We measure it via our energy intensity index. It's similar. We have an energy standard based on your size and complexity, and the lower your EII is, the more efficient you are. Here's the distribution curve for the base oil refineries, and you see the world's best. They're at the Q1, Q2 breakpoint. But how did they get there? Obviously, they have good operations, higher utilization drives better energy efficiency, but they also did some investment in capital projects. I have two graphs here. The graph on the left are capital investment for energy efficiency, and the graph on the right is capital investment for emissions reduction. Our capital investment index is a 4-year average, and the higher the index means that you've spent more money over the 4-year average for those projects. You can see the world's best are the blue line, and ROW, or rest of world, that's the red line. On energy efficiency, the world's best actually had more investment in 2014, which is 2010 to 2014, so it's a 4-year average. You can see that in those years, their energy investment was higher than the rest of the world. And then on the right, from emissions reduction, you'll see that the world's best actually spent a little less in terms of emissions reduction versus the rest of the world. But I saw that the energy efficiency occurred before the rest of the world did. Did that translate to lower carbon emissions? And this is our carbon emissions index, or CEI. Solomon's CEI measures atmospheric point sources within the base oil refinery. So I would characterize this as gate to gate. It's not to be confused with wheel to wells. Wells to wheels is not to be confused with cradle to grave or cradle to cradle. It's gate to gate. And if we look at the emissions from the point sources in the base oil refineries, you'll see that the world's best are first quartile. And we've seen that better energy efficiency results in lower carbon emissions. Let's now switch to yields. We found that the world's best actually have one quartile better performance in yields based on technology. And when I mean yields, I mean the amount of lubes, waxes, and specialties produced. Here's a distribution curve for yield, LWS, on the y-axis, and that's a percent of total input. And you'll see that I have two boxes there. I have the average yield percentage for hydroprocessing and the average yield percentage for solvents. And if I plot the world's best hydroprocessing refineries and the world's best solvent-based refineries, you'll see that they are one quartile better than the average. So not only do they have good operational availability, but when they're up and running, they're actually taking their raw materials and upgrading it to the highest amount of yield possible. Now, you know that yield is good, but you also need to have the optimum product mix. The optimum product mix is driven by the margins for each of the materials that are produced. This data is from our 2018 lube survey. And in 2018, there were higher margins for the heavier viscosity grades and also for bright stock. And as you can see, the world's best were in the first quartile in production of both of these products. So they were able to diversify their portfolio and move their portfolio and maximize products which have the highest margin. And that's very important, especially with changing market conditions. They were changing before they continue to change. I'm going to finish it up with maintenance. And in maintenance, specifically the turnaround strategies for the world's best refineries. On average, they had 20% longer run lengths between turnarounds. And when I mean run lengths, that's the amount of time between turnarounds. Our turnaround database went back to 2006. So we had 673 turnarounds in that database. The first thing that we looked at was interval. And this is where I mentioned that the world's best have longer intervals than the world average. In fact, you'll see that there's anywhere between 16% to 25% longer intervals. And when I mean intervals, I've broken them out by some specific lube units. LHYC is lube hydrocracking, Solvex is solvent extraction, and CD-wax is catalytic dewaxing or iso dewaxing. Now, obviously this is good for several reasons. One, the longer you can stretch out the maintenance intervals for your turnarounds, the longer that you have your equipment available to run, and that's a key to good operational availability. But for those of us who have worked in refineries, we do know that the longer interval between turnarounds, that gives a chance for your equipment to break, for more pieces of equipment to wear out. And sometimes you can extend interval, but then when you do come down for turnaround, the duration is longer because you have more things to fix. You may have discovery work and you have more time spent working on unplanned things. But we also looked at the world's best performance in terms of turnaround duration once they do come down. And in addition to extending interval, the world's best have figured out how to reduce the duration while they're down. In fact, for each of these units, you can see the average duration is anywhere from 22 to 27% shorter than the world average. We get asked many times, what's the secret to this? How did the world's best achieve that? Obviously, it's good turnaround execution. Solomon has a turnaround duration study where we benchmark 3 phases of turnaround execution. We look at the phase of shutdown and clearing equipment and getting it ready for maintenance. We look at the maintenance phase, just how long it takes to fix the equipment. And we also look at the startup phase, how long to fill equipment, circulate, heat up, start up, and get on test. So we are able to benchmark how people perform in each of those three phases. Specifically on the maintenance phase, we're finding out that the world's best are adopting and have adopted a strategy over time of replacing equipment versus repairing equipment. And when I mean equipment, this can be anywhere from something as small as a safety relief valve or a heat exchanger, all the way up to big things like vessels, like heaters, like reactors. Obviously, you could have higher material costs uh, via replacing versus repair, but there's obvious advantages in terms of less personnel required to install, which then shortens the timeline, which then allows maximum uptime or shorter duration for these turnarounds. These are some of the things that we're seeing that the world's best do. So with longer interval and shorter duration, there's a lower annualized downtime, and that links all the way back to where we started with good operational availability. So these are the 8 characteristics of what it takes to be a world's best refinery. First of all, they're very reliable, 97% plus on operational availability. It's a mix of hydroprocessing and solvent technology. They're not necessarily the newest facilities out there. Most likely they're integrated with a fuels refinery for advantages there. They tend to staff higher in areas that support good operational availability. They've invested in energy efficiency because they realize that good energy efficiency results in lower carbon emissions. They maximize their yields, and they maximize yields of the highest valued product. And they're very optimized on their turnaround strategy that allows for longer duration, longer intervals, and shorter durations. Our goal is to help each and every one of you out there on your journey to achieving world's best. And I do know that, especially in these trying times, that's probably something to think about in the future, right? We just need to survive what's going on today. But, you know, we've been talking with our CEO and our management team on exactly what message we should give clients as we go through these webinars on the world's best. And I think it's very good for me to read what guidance that our folks want to give you guys when it comes to this. They recognize that it's very challenging times for all of us, and during these challenging times, we need benchmarking now more than ever. To keep pace with the world's best, and I just reviewed what the world's best do, you need to be able to measure your KPIs. The best performers in our study are going to emerge from the first half of this year and maintain or even improve their leadership position. You know, sure, we're all hurting now, but when the recovery occurs, whether it's V-shaped or U-shaped, we don't want you to fall behind the pace setters in the industry. So I'm hoping that these insights will allow you to make good decisions this year to set the stage for recovery and to set the stage for your long-term viability, sustainability, and profitability. And Solomon is here to help you achieve those goals. So that being said, that's the end of the prepared presentation on the webinar on the world's best base oil refineries.